enterprise-level group policy strategy. In this nugget, which I admit in advance is going to be a little bit on the lengthy side, we are going to be discussing group policy strategy. First thing we need to discuss, though, is organizational unit design, because since group policy follows an order of inheritance or a scope of management along the lines of organizational units, you need to make sure that those are designed properly first. And then we'll kind of do a quick review on what group policy really is. And at this level, you probably already know, but we'll just quickly review that. And then we'll also address the scope of management. This is critical to understanding how to properly apply group policies and to have a predictable result. We'll also take a look here at modifying the policy scope. So we'll kind of go outside of this normal scope of management and see if there are modifiers that you can use to affect that. One of those modifiers you can also use is something called WMI filters, which can evaluate a system's hardware, software, or BIOS even, to see whether or not a policy should apply. Then we'll take a look at installing software, which you can also do. And then we'll take a look also at templates, which are new in Windows Server 2008, at least in terms of how they're actually applied now and where they're stored. And then finally, we'll take a look at device installation in Windows Server 2008 and how group policy objects can control that. Now, one of the first things I want to talk to you about here is something called OU design. Now, this could have easily been addressed under a previous nugget where we were discussing the designing of the Active Directory administrative model and the organizational structure. We could have addressed it then, but I wanted to save it for here because if you do not properly design your organizational units, you're going to have a really hard time with group policy objects, because GPO and the smart implementation of them depends upon a good OU design. So let's go ahead and take a look at some basics about this, and some of this will of course just be review. First of all, the organizational units that you're going to develop is really for your own use. It's just to simplify administration for your part. Your users don't know that they're in an OU probably. They don't even care, and it really is not going to affect them directly, but knowing or not knowing that. So it's really just for you, number one, so that you can look at the OUs and you can logically segment your users and computers into kind of logical groups, somewhat similar to security groups, at least in terms of the way we can think about it in that way. However, be aware of the fact that organizational units are not security groups. You might have a Tucson users security group, and you may also have a Tucson users organizational unit. They are not the same thing. The Tucson users security group could be in the Tucson users organizational unit, but they're not necessarily, not at all, the same thing. And a key difference there as well is that the security group, of course, can be used to assign permissions. An OU cannot be used to assign permissions, such as NTFS permissions. Also, organizational unit design is pretty big in terms of the IT management autonomy. It's not useful for isolation in most cases, because remember, for isolation, total isolation, you're going to have a different forest. But I might have an organization where, I have some enterprise admins at maybe in the domain, and then I have high-level administrators who are very capable and functional for everyday administration, that we might just delegate full control to an entire OU. In fact, I worked with the Army quite a bit this past year, and the Army does that for all of their various divisions through different locations. At least the divisions that I was working with. Their local administrators in the location where I was, their whole administration came from delegating control to an organizational unit. And of course, the Army has a very good system developed, and if they had poorly designed their organizational units, then they could potentially have put people in charge of the wrong OUs and the wrong contents of those OUs, including the users groups and computers. But for the autonomy of this, they were delegated control of an OU, and they pretty much operated on their own unless they needed something from a higher level. And then there's also a hierarchy that's involved in this. One thing you have to really be careful with OU design is that you allow the hierarchy to benefit you. Allow it to work to your advantage. This is seldomly going to be the case if you decide to develop your hierarchy according to an org chart. So do not take your org chart and kind of pattern your OU design after that. I mean, after all, normally the CEO is at the top of the org chart, right? Well, and then everything else is underneath them, including all the employees and assets of the company and all that kind of thing. Well, certainly you're not going to put the CEO as the enterprise admin. They probably don't even have anywhere near the level of computer knowledge that your help desk does. So why would you put them at the top of the OU design? Well, you don't. So just throw out the org chart, at least for most purposes, except for reference purposes. But otherwise, do not base your OU design on it. And now, another way that you would design OUs very commonly is by department. The human resources OU, the marketing OU, the research OU, the distribution OU. All those types of things could be done. And then within those OUs, you might have sub-OUs. For example, under marketing, you might have an OU department there for the graphic arts that maybe publishes all of your marketing brochures. You might have another one for managers. You might have another one if you put sales in there too, a sales and marketing. You might have a sales OU. You might have an IT staff OU. Kind of depends partially on the size of the department. If you have a small marketing department with 12 people in it, then probably you're going to throw everybody in the same OU. It's just for simplicity's sake. The other thing with OUs, and this is something that I could talk about here in the OU design, is that you don't want to over-design your OUs. And that is again the case where maybe you only have 12 people in there. Well, there's no sense in creating a separate OU for these 2 people over here that are help desk folks and these 2 people over here that are in HR in the marketing department. So you want to make it as simple as you can there. Also, you can divide things up according to geography. This is a very common way of doing this. So if you're an organization with offices in multiple locations like branches, then you might have a Tucson branch. You might have a Phoenix, a Los Angeles, a New York branch. They might also have corresponding organizational units. So geography is a very common way to do that. Or you might have both. So for example here, I might have a Phoenix OU, but with underneath that, maybe I've got an IT staff OU. And then maybe I've also got a sales staff organizational unit. And then within the sales staff, they have some laptop computers. So I might have computer accounts in this OU. So you can divide this up a number of different ways. Now here let's take a look at an example of all of this. You can see that I've got the nuggetlab.com domain, and then I've got an OU here called just Corp. And then I've got Building 1, Building 2, assuming we're on the same campus, for example. Now, besides that, boy, doesn't this look awfully familiar? Building 1, admins, desktops, laptops, servers, users, and the same exact descriptions down here for these OUs. And then I look at the user accounts here, and I look at a bunch of user accounts here, and guess what? If we find that we're administering both of these users in both of these buildings in exactly the same way, then there's no real use in creating 2 separate organizational units if they have the same group policy objects on them, and if we have the same kind of security requirements, and everything really is administered the same way, then I'm kind of creating additional administrative overhead for myself by creating 2 OUs. And of course, with just 2 OUs, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that much additional overhead. But if you multiply that out by sites and geographical divisions and by thousands of users scattered across the globe, but we're administering everything exactly the same way, then it probably created additional work for myself. Now then, on the other hand, as you do get into more geographically dispersed locations, so for example, maybe this wasn't a building one, maybe this was Phoenix, and maybe this was Taipei, China. Well, I have probably different administrators there. I probably have different technical requirements. I probably have a lot of different ways that these users over there would then be managed in Taipei, China. Then that would make sense. I probably do need to keep them in separate organizational units. Just remember, once again, the OU is designed to make your administration simpler, not more complicated and more difficult. You only create separate OUs as a general rule. You only create separate OUs when you need to make administration easier. And to kind of take that to a ludicrous stage, let's say that we had these building 2 users down here, and we're all on one floor, but we've got 4 sections of cubicles. I wouldn't create another OU underneath here, cubicle farm 1, and then a cubicle farm 2, and a cubicle farm 3 and 4. So you see, that would get to be kind of ludicrous, and if I take it to that ludicrous stage, you can kind of see how this gets ridiculous. Now, there's another extreme with this as well. I might try to oversimplify things, and then get myself in another kind of a dilemma here. So for example, if I took all of these building 2 users and I put them up here into building 1 users, and that's just a message saying that they will now all have the same group policy objects. Then you can see that I've got all these users up here. Now, disregarding for the time being that they're also kind of counterintuitively named building 2 user, I could, of course, rename all of those, but disregarding that, this would be a bad situation. This would be a bad example of putting too many in one OU. Let's say that these building 2 users and these building 1 users have different requirements. Maybe they're similar. They have some different things in terms of group policy objects that we've turned on for, their desktop administration and things. But building 2 users have a totally different set of applications that we want to deploy using group policy objects. Well, in this case, I can link a group policy object to this OU. But if I do, both building 1 and building 2 will get those same applications. And this could get complicated if I have then inadvertently distributed applications to building 1 users that they don't really need or don't use or don't even care about. And yet, I have to pay for a license for each one of these users. Well, now I've started to also cost myself money. So the way around that would be I could use security group filtering, and we'll work with that a little bit later on here in the same nugget. But if I do that, then I complicate my administration again. So once again, in this case, it might have been better to take all these users, leave them down here in building 2 users, and then create a totally separate group policy object to deploy only their application. And then another reason why talking about OU structure and design is very important for our current topic of group policy objects is because I could link an OU somewhere in this hierarchy. But if I link it, say, up to here, then guess what? It flows downward, just like gravity. It flows downhill here to this building. OU and these admins and these desktops and servers and users, and to this building and all of these sub OUs underneath it as well. So if you link a group policy object to a higher OU, it always flows downward. However, if I really only care about linking the OU to these users, because again, maybe they're the only ones that need the application that I'm deploying, then I will just link it to this one OU. And since it's already at the bottom of the hierarchy here, it doesn't flow up to all of these, it stays right where it is. Now, if I were to then create a separate sub OU, building 2 users, and then building 2 users, managers underneath here, or something like that, new organizational unit, and I would just say managers. Okay. If I do that, and I link a group policy object here, then of course it's going to flow down to the building 2 users and the manager's organizational unit as well. And by the way, before I bypass this, did you notice something else that happened there? Let me create another OU here as well. New organizational unit. And I'll just call this one, IT staff, just for lack of a more creative idea right now. Notice that it says this, protect container from accidental deletion. This is a new feature in Windows Server 2008 because in the past it was way too easy to accidentally right-click on the wrong one. Maybe I wanted to right-click on the managers and get rid of them. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? But instead, I right-clicked here instead and I just carelessly said delete, and then I say yes. In 2000 and 2003, that would just go away, including all of the contents. I might have thousands of users in that particular organizational unit, or highly protected or sensitive and important accounts. And by clicking on yes, I would have then immediately deleted all of them. But notice that in Windows Server 2008, it says that I can't. It's not really that I don't have sufficient privileges per se. It's that it's because of the way the permissions have been assigned to them. I can reverse those permissions. So, for example, in order to do that, I would go to View, and I'm just off track here just a little bit to show you an important new feature. And if I go to Advanced Features and then expand my OUs back out again, then we'll see here that I can right-click and choose Properties, and notice that there's a Security tab. Notice that it also has on here some special permissions. And if we take a look at the Advanced Permissions, we'll notice that there is an item there, if I click on Edit, that says delete or delete subtree. Okay, that has been set to deny, and because of that reason, it does not allow me to deny it otherwise. But now once I've removed that permission, I can then choose delete, and I say yes, and now that OU is completely gone. Then I'm going to go back to our normal view here just to make things simpler to look at. So in 2008, what do you have to do? By default, when you create a new OU, it's going to prevent the object from accidental deletion. In order to remove that, I need to go into the security permissions of it, and I can only view those by choosing View and Advanced. Once I've done that, then I can remove those delete permissions. Well, let's go ahead and talk about what group policy actually is. Now, I do teach a week-long course in this, a live training course with my friend Jeremy Moskowitz. So it's a little bit difficult for me to compact all of this, but I'll do the very best that I can, and we'll try to be as pertinent as we can to the 70-647 exam. Now, first of all, as a quick review, because you're probably already aware of some things relating to group policy, it really controls nearly all aspects of the user's experience. I mean, you don't want the user to change their wallpaper, you can take that capability away from them. Maybe you don't want them to see the control panel at all. Well, you can take that away from them. Also, you can use group policy to configure security, and in fact, it already has configured security. So if you've never created your own group policy, you're of course still subject to the default domain controllers policy and the default domain policy, which is where by default your security passwords are configured and stuff like that, such as the length and password complexity and the like. Also, Kerberos settings, user rights, auditing, all of that stuff is configured in a group policy object. Also, the group policy can be very useful for doing things such as redirecting folders. This is something that I actually do for my own company, because instead of telling my users, and fighting with them and always telling them, make sure you save things in your home directory, which gets promptly ignored, they decide to save things in documents or my documents instead, and then I don't have all of my documents in a central location because part of them are stored in the user's own profile. And you know how that goes. Because it's in their profile, if they have a laptop, then I cannot centrally do things such as archiving and backup, central virus scans, things of this nature. But I redirect their documents or their my documents to a server in a central location where I can then manage all that data. And then we can also use it to install software. Now, a lot of larger corporations do not use group policy to deploy software because there are other methods that they may already be using, such as Microsoft's SMS, or now it's SCCM, or System Center Security Manager. Or excuse me, that's actually System Center Configuration Manager, so SMS or SCCM. This is the newer version that's being used nowadays. These are more elaborate methods that can do things such as bandwidth throttling and a lot of other full-featured things that you might want to have in deployment of software. But you can still do installation of software with group policy. It does work very well, but it's just a little bit more basic. I do think, however, you're going to see this particular topic on the exam for the 70-647, so I would be somewhat aware of this. And really, I don't think it's going to probably be here's how you install software so much as it is the scope of deploying software. And this again goes directly back to properly designing your organizational units. And if you have to override some default behavior for group policy deployment so that it doesn't apply to certain folks, then you might use things such as security group filtering. But we'll address that as well here as we go. Now, just as a quick review also, let's go ahead and take a look at creating a group policy object. I'm just going to kind of arbitrarily and quickly create one here for us to be able to work with and just to refresh our memory. But here, we're in Features Group Policy Management, and notice that I've browsed my way down to our current domain. I'm going to, what I normally do is I go to Group Policy Objects, and I'll normally right-click and create my policy here because that makes it an unlinked policy. And I do that as a strategy so that I don't accidentally link a policy to the wrong OU, or create a policy and start to configure it, but not completely finish it. Maybe it's lunchtime or something like that. Nothing stops for lunch, and then accidentally implement a half-baked policy. So I usually create one here, make sure it's fully got all the settings that I want, and then I will link it. But in this case, for expediency's sake, and this is also still acceptable, I'll go ahead and go to my Building 1 users. Let's use them. I'll right-click here to choose Create a GPO in this domain, and link it here. Okay, and then I'm just going to call this. Let's say that my users in Vista are fiddling around with a sidebar too much, so we want to take away their sidebar. So I'll just call this Remove Sidebar. Okay. And then I'll click OK. Now, of course, a new feature also with Windows Server 2008, and it's not just with 2008, it's with the new Group Policy Management Console here that's available for download as well with others, is that you can now use a starter GPO. And if you create a starter GPO, then it will give you commonly used settings that you might want to use kind of as a template. But we're just going to use this right here, and then I'm going to go into this and remove the sidebar. Now, first of all, let's observe that the sidebar is available and visible. And here you can see that the sidebar is indeed on, and I think these are all just the default sidebar, gadgets, as we call each one of these little items that you see there. Of course, I also have an ulterior motive for wanting to get rid of the sidebar, and that is it's getting close to lunchtime, and I don't want to be in the middle of a clip and then revisit this, and then you see that it suddenly jumps from 11:20 to like 1:20. Okay, so sometimes I take 2-hour lunch breaks, okay? Don't judge me, people, and don't tell CBT Nuggets about this either. But anyway, I don't want you to see that it suddenly jumped ahead right in the middle of my recording. So I'm going to get rid of that Windows sidebar, and of course I could also just remove the gadget, but I'm going to be more elaborate here. Now, first of all, what if you can't exactly remember or don't know where that sidebar setting is located under your policies? Now remember, we have a computer configuration policy that affects all things relating to computers. If I configure a policy on the computer configuration side, then I have to link it to an OU that contains the computer account I'm trying to affect. Likewise, if I'm trying to affect user configuration settings, then I need to make sure that I link this policy that I'm about to create to wherever I might have user accounts configured. Okay, now I've got into user configuration. If I can't remember exactly where the sidebar settings are, I can right-click on administrative templates, and I happen to know they're actually under Windows Components down here. But then I could choose filter options, and I could choose, keyword filters, sidebar. And then having done that, if the filters aren't turned on, you can check the box right here, check the item right there to turn that on. Now I see that there's all settings here. I should see a few sidebar items there, but if I want to know exactly where it is, like I said here, it's under Windows Components. Now I can identify where this is located, and this makes it a lot easier to search through more than 3,000 group policy settings. So, I can just go now to Windows Components and Windows Sidebar. Like I mentioned earlier, I could just go right to it. Or I could have left it on the filtered view. Either way. So I'm going to turn off the Windows Sidebar, and I'll just enable that setting. Remember, not configured means to just not do anything to allow default behavior to apply, or to allow higher level group policy objects that are further up the hierarchy to go ahead and take effect. If I would choose disabled, then in this case that would have no effect, really, because it's already by default set to be disabled. Okay, if I choose not configured or disabled, they both will do the same thing. They allow the Windows sidebar to continue to be left on. So really the only thing that's going to affect any settings is the enabled setting here, which would do that. Turn off Windows sidebar. Sometimes they're a little bit counterintuitive the way these are, because usually when you look at something that's enabled, you say, okay, so that'll enable the sidebar, right? No, that enables this setting to turn off the Windows sidebar. So I'll do that, and I'll close this all up. Now, where is that? It's linked to the Building 1 users. Now, I've already got my user logged on, so as a quick review also, if I want to enable a setting, I can run GP update. Now, I don't have to be an administrator to be able to do that. I can do this from a command line or from my current location right here. And I can also do a /force if I want to kind of give it a kick in the pants. And it'll go ahead and update the policy. Now, in reality, I didn't need to do the force setting, because what it does is it looks to see if there's any new or changed policies, and it does this by a specific version number. Since it will see a new version number there, it should go ahead and update this policy without me having to use the force setting. Force will update it regardless of the version numbers. Now, as with some other policies, again, also, you can see that the sidebar is still there. Some things you do have to log off for computer accounts, or restart for computer accounts, and we'll see this take effect as soon as I log back on here. So now here I've logged off, and I'm logging back on again, and we can see that indeed I got this stupid thing here. I'll clear that off. But indeed, I have no Windows sidebar off to the side over here. In fact, even if I were to try to bring it back by going to All Programs and then going to Accessories and Windows Sidebar, notice that I can't. It doesn't let me. It says it's managed by my system administrator, so not a whole lot I can do about that. All right, folks, it's time for me to go to lunch, and in a couple of hours, I'll come back and resume recording. Okay, I'm back from lunch. Now let's go ahead and take a look here at something called the scope of management. This is critical to understanding how group policy objects actually apply. And the first things I want to talk to you about are not actually directly group policy objects at all. The first one is default settings. Now, there are certain operating system settings that are there by default. For example, you don't have to turn on the ability somehow to look at the control panel. It's already there. That's hard-coded into the operating system, although you could use a policy to turn that off. But you have certain operating system system defaults. And then you'll also have local group policy settings. So for example, if I click on Start and just go to gpedit.msc, you'll notice that when I open up this console, that I can access local computer policy settings for computer configuration, and user configuration. This will affect only the currently logged on user and this local computer. This is not something that I can set that will apply domain-wide or in an OU or a site or some other broad scope that I could otherwise do in Active Directory, because this truly only applies to this one machine. Therefore, as an administrator, I want to try to limit the amount of times that I use a local policy editor, because I'd much rather use the power of inheritance that's part of organizational unit design and group policy objects to be able to create policies that will apply to many computers that require the same settings instead of visiting individual computers to make those settings. Now, another thing we can take a look at here is something called the multi-level group policy object. Now, in order to understand MLGPOs, or it's actually multiple local GPOs is what it's called. Sometimes they call them multi-level, but the official name is multiple local GPOs. You have to understand how to edit those. And here I can't just type gpedit.msc. I mean, I could, but all that would do is open up the same editor that we saw a moment ago. What I need to do here is to open up an empty MMC console and then add the proper snap-in. And the snap-in that I'm going to need to enter is this group policy object editor, not the management, but the object editor, and then click add. And notice that now it prompts me for the local computer, and if I click on finish, it's pretty much the same as typing in gpedit.msc in the first place. But if I choose browse, now notice that I can look for different computers, but more importantly, for MLGPOs, this is where it all relates, I can go to different users. Okay, so in the past, on previous operating systems, I could create a local policy. And the thing is, maybe I would, close down Control Panel entirely so that nobody could access it. Unfortunately, this would also affect help desk and administrators when they logged onto the machine and tried to troubleshoot it. Well, they couldn't access Control Panel. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with that. But now what we can do is we can have different settings for administrators or non-administrators. So I'll put administrators here, and then I'll add it in again. And this time I'll add in non-administrators, for example, or any other individual user account that is logged on in the past. Notice that there was also the trainer account in my list to choose from there. That's because that account has logged on. But anyway, what I could do then, and let me click OK here, what I could do is to have different settings for administrators or non-administrators, and notice that it doesn't include computer configuration because this only really relates to the user side of things. So this is an innovative new thing that you can do so that you can lock out people who aren't administrators and kind of tighten down some settings, but you can loosen up the settings for anybody that is an administrator. And that's what this is about when we're talking about MLGPO, or multiple local group policy objects. You can also configure policy on a site, and again, this particular series has not a lot of how-to items, but just as a quick refresher, in order to configure a policy on a site, if I go down in here, I'll see that there is a sites item, but once I click on it, there's nothing there. I know I've got a site. I think I have at least a Phoenix site. So what I have to do is to right-click on it and choose Show Sites, and then I choose which sites I want to appear, and then I can right-click here to link an existing GPO. But notice that I cannot create a GPO. I have to have some kind of an existing GPO, and then click OK to link it to that site, and then now we'll have that policy linked. So it's not the same as with something like an OU where you can create and link a GPO there. Okay, now I'm going to remove that because I don't really need it. Right there. But that's how that can work. I can link something to a site. Normally, you don't link to a site unless it has something to do with network settings. For example, if I have a site that has a specific proxy server that everybody needs to be able to use, then I'll set that up probably in a policy and link it to that site. That way, when even when people from outside of my office, from other branch offices, for example, come to my location, they'll use my proxy server. That way, they don't have to go out across a WAN link, use their proxy server, then have it deliver content all the way back across the WAN link to their systems. So that would be a good example of that sort of thing. Then we also have domain policies that we can configure. This would be similar to how you create it for an OU. I would simply go up to nuggetlab.com, create and link a GPO in this domain, and link it here. Now the thing is, this will apply to the entire domain, and that might be too comprehensive of a scope. So for example, if I'm trying to remove the ability to change the screensaver, let's say. If I set that up on the domain, that could affect tens of thousands of users in my organization, some of whom might want to access that screensaver setting. Maybe I really only want to set that up for my kiosk machines, so that it constantly displays some kind of a flash demo or something like that. And I never want them to turn the screensaver on for my trade shows and stuff. Well, if I link that to the domain, wow, that's going to kill me, because I will not be able to have the screensaver come on anymore. So, watch the scope for how you do that. For the domain, you can set up certain policies that apply to it, but you generally only want to do that for things you really truly want to apply to the entire domain. Another thing to keep in mind, just as a quick note, there's a default domain policy there. I usually recommend that you leave that alone, except for the password settings. But anything else that you want to apply to the entire domain, I recommend you create a separate policy and you leave the default domain policy alone, because you generally want that to be kind of untouched and pristine, except for, once again, the password policies. Although you could create another policy on the domain level. Let's say I had a fourth policy down here called passwords, and if I use these arrow keys to move it up to the top, then it would take precedence, and I can have a separate policy for my passwords, and anything that it conflicts with would then apply. And that's another good thing to understand here as well in terms of order of inheritance. If you have multiple policies at a single level, like I do on the domain level here, whichever one is number 1 has the highest precedence, whichever one is number 3, or whatever the lowest number is, would have the lowest precedence. And what happens is they're read from the bottom to the top. So if they have any conflicting settings, initially this setting would apply, and then any settings here would also apply, and they might concatenate, so they'd have cumulative settings. But then if this policy has anything that disagrees with any of these previous two settings, then this one would win. And then in addition to these, and by the way, once again, just as a reminder, all of these things are Active Directory related from this point down, and these are local settings. And this is, of course, where I'm going to be most concerned. Most of your policies, probably 99% of the time, you're going to be configuring policies on the OU level. Okay, so that's normally where that's going to take place. And then if you have sub-OUs or child OUs, then of course the policies will flow down that way as well. And the way this works is I can have a policy set on the site, domain, OU, and sub-OU, and anything that's read first, and it starts out at the broadest scope first, so the site's read first, then the domain, then OUs, and then child OUs, the first one would have the least precedence in terms of overriding anything. So, if I have a setting here that says to disable control panel, but over here on this sub-OU, this last sub-OU, I have a setting that says enable control panel, then this one would win over this one, because it's going to be read last. It starts from the broad, goes to more narrow, till it gets to the final level of the OU, where the user or computer account is actually located, and where there's a group policy attached and linked. This is the one that's going to take precedence, the last level there, okay? Now let's take a quick look at how that works. You see, for example, here's my Building 1 users. Remember, we logged on and we saw that the sidebar was removed because of this policy. Let me go ahead and delete this real quick and put it at a higher level in the hierarchy. So I'm going to put remove sidebar, and I'm going to drag that up to the top of Building 1. Now this is going to apply to not only my Building 1 users, but guess what? Yeah, also my Building 1 admins. But maybe my admins here, right here, maybe they have some diagnostic gadgets and things that they've added to the sidebar that they need to be able to see. Well, they can't see them right now because we removed the sidebar. So, the users down here will still have the sidebar removed because it will flow down through inheritance. But I got to do something about my admins here. So I'm going to create and link a GPO here, and I'm going to call this add sidebar. And then I'm just going to do this very quickly here. I'm going to right-click and edit that policy. So I'll go back to the administrative templates and Windows settings, and then go back down to Windows sidebar. And then down here, remember the turn off Windows sidebar item? I'm going to, since it's left it not configured right now, this basically would do nothing. And it would still inherit the setting to remove the sidebar. So now I'm going to choose disabled, and that will conflict with the enabled setting in the previous policy. Okay, so it's now set at disabled. So what do we got again? This enables remove the sidebar. This disables remove the sidebar, so it effectively adds the sidebar back in. Now let me go ahead and log back on to my Vista machine as one of the accounts. So we'll go on as one of the admin accounts there, and I'll just log on as Building 1 Admin 1. I think that's a legitimate account. Maybe not. See, I think I just typed the password in wrong. Let's try that again. Okay, so now it's logging me on, and here I should see the sidebar because, remember, I have disabled the remove sidebar policy, so now it should come back and appear, or at least be available to me here under this account. And we got a desktop here. Let's go see if I can go to accessories and access the Windows sidebar. And what do you know, but here it comes. Ooh, look at the time. I just got back from lunch, too. Okay, people, don't pay attention to that. I'm sure there's something wrong with this the system clock or something like that. That can't be right. Okay, so let's just minimize this before I embarrass myself any further. Boy, you're thinking, James, what do you do during a 2-hour lunch? Well, a nap could have been involved, but I would never admit that out loud. Okay, let's go ahead and take... I'm just kidding, folks. Let's go ahead and take a look here now also at some things that we can use to override that default order of inheritance, okay? So, because we saw, let me get to the right location here. We saw that our policy flowed down from building 1 to everybody, including our admins, but we didn't want that, so we overrode that by putting in another policy down here, okay? But the remove sidebar would still apply to these folks. There are other ways to adjust the policy. They're a little bit less elegant, and you should try to avoid them if possible, but you need to know that they are at least possible to use. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. Alright, now let's go ahead and take a look at how we can modify the policy scope so that it goes beyond or outside of its normal order of inheritance or any other methods there. Here, remember that we got our user accounts under the admins that get the sidebar back because of this setting. By the way, also notice that, look, it has kind of it looks like a shortcut arrow. It's not, but it looks kind of like one. Well, that's my visual indicator that this is just a link. It's not the actual policy itself. The policy is right here. And the link to it is right here. So this just tells me that this user accounts OU is being pointed to this actual policy. Now, let's take a look at some other ways to override inheritance here. I'm going to right-click on this and choose Delete. Okay, so I've removed the Add Sidebar item. And then if we quickly log back on as that user account, as that administrator, here we are. We're now logged on as that administrator again. Then we'll see that if we try to access the Windows sidebar now, can't do it. Okay, so we've unfortunately come back under the authority of this policy right here, and it's caused us not to be able to have our sidebar. Another thing we could have done instead of creating another separate policy is we could right-click here and choose Block Inheritance. Okay, that's one of the things you can do is to use the setting called Block Inheritance. This is a very heavy-handed way of preventing policy from applying, and let me show you why. First of all, notice that it gives you a visual indicator of a little exclamation point there, but it does block the remove sidebar item. In fact, if I run GP update, I might be able to actually get this back real quick. And let's go back to our start menu and let's quickly hit Windows sidebar, and sure enough, there it appears again. Okay, so I've been able to block the policy inheritance here, and now I don't have this remove sidebar anything anymore. Guess what though? We have some other previously existing policies that we used in other nuggets here. One of those was auto enroll user and computer certificates. Well, now I might not get any certificates that I need to get anymore. Now I don't have the printer location policies anymore either. I might try to look for a printer and it not show up pre-populated for me anymore, like we looked at in a previous nugget as well. So those are a couple of things that I've done. Now I've not only cut myself off from this policy, but also from anything else that was in the scope of management. The slight exception to that is in the default domain policy. The security settings, such as password policies, will always apply, even if I block inheritance. Okay, those are just kind of hard-coded in. So this is kind of a heavy-handed way of preventing myself from getting a specific policy because it actually blocks all policy. Okay, so at least I got my sidebar back though, right? Well, what happens if maybe I've got an enterprise admin or a domain admin further up here that has a higher level of authority than these admins, and they say, wait a minute, they've blocked that policy, and they're blocking these other policies that they need to have. So, if anything else, we want to make sure that they don't have the remove sidebar. So what they could do is say, this one has to punch through no matter what. Even if they miss these, they have to get this one. Then they could right-click here and choose Enforced. Notice that there's now a padlock on it, and that's what we're talking about here. We can use, for modify the policy scope, we can use the enforce setting, and now they'll be forced to get this policy no matter what. So, once again, I'm going to run GP update. Notice, by the way, that I changed it so it doesn't have the clock in there anymore. I don't want you to see how often I take breaks. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close this up, and I'm going to just exit it. And then now notice that if I try to access the Windows sidebar again now, and yeah, once again, I can't because I'm subject to this policy for remove sidebar. I still block all of these, but since I right-clicked and chose enforced, this one I have to get no matter what. Now, another thing we could do is to filter the policy scope. Okay, we can do that by an account, either a user or a group account. Normally, just as with everything else, if we have to do it at all, we try to use a group account, but you could do it on an individual user account basis as well. Let's go to an example for that. So, if I go back to Server Manager here, notice that I've got, in my user accounts here, multiple users. And by the way, this looks just like this up here. This is an Active Directory users and computers where it shows the actual accounts. Down here is the group policy management console. Okay, this is not the same interface. It just looks very similar. Anyway, I've got several accounts in there. And in the background here, I logged on as one of those other accounts. And sometimes the wallpaper appears in remote desktop, and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, so now I got it. But I'm on building 1 admin 02. And again, if I try to go to accessories and Windows sidebar, again, I'm locked out from being able to use that. And I should be, because this policy is punching through to these user accounts. Now, what's another way to manipulate the order of inheritance? Maybe we truly do not want any of our administrators to get the sidebar except for I can't seem. I'm stuttering over my words, folks. Sorry about that. Building 1 admin 2, the one who's currently logged on. Now, we saw that they don't have the sidebar, but we want to give them back. But we don't want the other administrators that are in this OU to be able to get it either. So we want to be very selective. Let's go up and look at this. Be very selective. We want this person to get the sidebar. All these other people, we do not want to get the sidebar. How can we be that specific? Here's what we can do. We're going to go into this, and again, this is not something you do every day or very often, but you can do it this way. And I'm going to go into this policy here, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at it. Notice that if I look over on the right, it says security filtering down here, and it says authenticated users. This is the default security item on a policy, and this means that it applies to anybody that logs on, even enterprise admins, domain admins, building 1 admins, anybody. Okay, as long as you're an authenticated user, you get the policy. What I can do, though, is to be more granular with that by going to the Delegation tab, and there again is my authenticated users. If I go ahead and click on Advanced now, you'll see why the authenticated users get the policy, because they have both the read and the apply group policy permission set on them. But if I don't want a specific user like building 1 admin 02 to be able to get this, if I want to exempt this person from being able to apply that policy, then I will deny them the apply group policy setting here. And this works a lot like a lot of other permission settings in share permissions, in NTFS permissions and everything. And that is that deny will override everything, so that even though this user right here is also a member of authenticated users and would normally receive the policy because of that, in this case, when their specific user account is added to the permissions here, and we have the deny permission set, that will override. And that's just what this tells us, is that the deny permission will override. So what I'm going to do now is, I think I can do that with just a GP update. I'll force it just in case. And what we'll see here happen now is once the policy updates, I should be able to get that particular Windows sidebar back. So now let me go back to this Vista computer where I've got my building 1 admin 02 user logged on. Now when I click on Windows sidebar, boy, will I get it? Will I not get it? What should happen is I should be able to see it because I exempted myself using the deny permission on that policy. Therefore, now it appears. And great Scott, there's the clock again. Somehow I've got to get rid of that. So you see a few different ways to override the default way that policies do apply. You can block inheritance, okay, and that was where we had this thing right here where we right-clicked and choose block inheritance. We got the little blue thing. Then the other thing we could do is to override that. We could go up here to the actual policy that we want to make darn good and sure it gets pushed down. We enforced it. Okay, and then finally the last thing we did was we went to the delegation tab, and by going to the advanced item, we added a user account. Now I could have also added in a group account here, and we went down here to deny the apply group policy permission. Those are the main three ways that we can override the default way that the scope of management takes place. But the thing to keep in mind here as well is this. If you find that you're having to block inheritance here and custom modify these permissions and enforce here and all that kind of stuff very often, then something's wrong with your OU design. Because it shouldn't be that much work. This should be the rare exception when you do this. In fact, it might only be for troubleshooting purposes to see the way policies are applying. You should not have to do this too terribly often if your OUs have been designed to take full advantage of the normal scope of management and order of inheritance. But at the same time, I do expect to see that very topic of all of these things: blocking inheritance, enforcing, filtering by user or group, or WMI filters, which I'll cover shortly here. I do expect to see a lot of those things on the exam. And why is that? Well, it's not because it's a practical thing to use in everyday administration, but I think Microsoft will probably have it on the exam to make things more complicated and challenging for you, just out of the goodness of their hearts. Now, on the previous whiteboard, I mentioned that you can order the scope of inheritance or the scope of management and override that based upon WMI filters. This goes beyond things such as blocking inheritance and the like, and instead what we can do is to apply a group policy object strictly based upon any of these types of characteristic, any aspect of a computer. For example, what hardware it has. Maybe I've got a new software application that requires a lot of hard drive space. So I could configure a WMI filter, link it to the GPO that deploys that software, and say only install on computers that have at least 2 gigabytes worth of hard drive space left, or free space. Or I might say only install on machines that have at least 4 gigabytes of RAM. So I can have the WMI filter evaluate a system's hardware, and then if it evaluates as true, then it will go ahead and apply that group policy object. And if it applies as false, or it evaluates as false, then it will not apply that group policy object. Other things it can check through are BIOS. Maybe I have a certain version of the BIOS that I want to apply some kind of an update to or something. Which operating system I'm running. Vista, 2008, 2003, 2000. Any operating system I want to evaluate. And then maybe even which software is installed. So you can create a WMI filter that says if it has X version of a software, maybe it's an outdated version of the software in the group policy object, then I can say if it's outdated, then install this group policy object, or the software in this group policy object. Also, updates. Maybe we have a known issue such that until we apply a certain update from Microsoft, the software we're trying to install will fail. So we only want to install the software if they have received a given update. So a lot of different criteria that you can use for this, and of course we can use this to filter a group policy object. Now, I've kind of already offline here pre-baked a scenario to show you about. So for example, here if I go to Server Manager, I created a policy, linked it to the domain, and this is called Power Plan Save Energy. Maybe we have somebody who's gotten on the bandwagon in our company, and it's a good bandwagon to get on, I suppose, and they say, you know what, we need to really be saving energy. So we want to forcibly apply the energy savings. Let's go ahead and take a look at the policy. Okay, so we'll go up here to Policies, Administrative Templates. I think it's under System where I set this up. And then there it is, Power Management. So as I open this up, we can specify a custom active power plan or set an active power plan. In this case, I decided to select an existing active power plan, and I decided to use Power Saver. So I enabled this, and I used Power Saver as opposed to something like High Performance there, okay? So that's the one we've got turned on, and yes, it does apply to the entire domain. Well, this is great for my desktop users because they just leave at night and they have their systems possibly left on, and we're burning electricity all night long for no good reason. However, caused a problem in the server room. Yeah, all the servers went into sleep or suspend, and my clients on the other side of the globe that tried to connect to my web server couldn't because the server shut down, basically. And of course, I know there's other things that can take place, such as wake on LAN or other activities that could awaken it, such as scheduled tasks and all. But overall, that's still a very risky thing to have on my servers. Man, great Scott, I don't want that to apply to my servers. They got to be on 24/7. So, what we could do with this is we could create a WMI filter, and I've done that down here. What you do is you go to WMI filters, and I'm going to go ahead and edit the one that I already created so you can see what it looks like. I simply clicked on Add. And when I did, I just entered in this information. Now, exactly what you enter in is a little bit more outside of our study, but this is just an example, and if you want to use this, you're welcome to it. It's not really case sensitive, but I'm kind of using the conventional case that you'll usually see in this kind of a script. And what I'm saying here is, select star from operating system, Win32 operating system. So I'm looking for an operating system where the name has anything in it that is the word Vista. Okay, so this policy now, if I link this WMI filter to it, it's only going to apply to my Vista computers, not even my XP machines, only to Vista. You know, I could do this any way I want to. Now, once I create the WMI filter, it just sits there and it doesn't do anything until I then go up to an actual policy, and in this case, the Power Plan Save Energy policy, and I choose the WMI filter for Windows Vista that I pre-created and that I just showed you a moment ago. And now what will happen is, if I go to my Vista computer over here and go to Control Panel, we'll see that when we try to go to, where is it? System and Maintenance, I think, and Power Options down here, then we'll see that we can try to change these settings. And you know, you do have to be an administrator, so I can try to change settings that are currently unavailable. I'll enter in some administrative credentials. But then, guess what? It won't let me do it. Settings are managed by your system administrator. That's because of that group policy object that I created. But when I apply this policy to the domain, will it apply to this local computer as well, which is a domain controller? It's one of my servers. It's not a Vista machine. So it will not evaluate true against this policy down here. Now, when I go to Control Panel on this server, it looks initially the same, so I try to change the settings. But then what happens is, look, yeah, I can change this to something else, or I can create a different power plan if I want to. So I can do all of these things now that I couldn't have done before because it does not evaluate as true for Windows Vista. Therefore, this policy does not apply to my Windows Server 2008 computer. All right, let's talk now also about software deployment GPOs. You can deploy software using a group policy object, as I mentioned earlier. Two different ways of doing it. You can assign it. You can assign it to either a user or a computer, and this would, of course, be done by creating the policy and then linking it to an OU that contains computer accounts, like this right here, or to users. Okay, it depends upon whether you're deploying it to users or computers, obviously. Okay. So that's one way to do it. The other thing is with assigned software is it's forcibly installed. Once I go ahead and create a policy and link it to the OU, then it's going to install whether the user likes it or not the next time they log on or the next time the computer starts up. Computer software will only install not from a GP update, but after a restart of the computer, and user software will only install, again, not only after a GP update, not after a GP update, but only after a log off and a log on. Okay, they have to log on fresh. Then you can also publish software. Now what this will do is it's going to allow the software to be available in Control Panel as available software that users can install from the network. This is available only to users, so you only configure this on the user configuration side of the policy, whereas with assigned software, you can apply it to the user configuration or the computer configuration setting of your policy. Also, it's an optional install. If users decide they don't want it, they don't have to install it. It's just available for them, and we kind of tacitly allow users to install it even though they're not administrators, just by the fact that we are publishing that said software. One thing to keep in mind with this as well is that you do have to have a software application on a network file share, and it has to be an MSI file. It cannot be setup.exe or install.exe or something like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at a real quick example here. Here I want to publish software to, how about my admins again? Maybe some of my admins really like to use, I don't know, WinZip. And what I've done here is I downloaded the shareware version of WinZip, the free version, from their website. And then what I did was, it doesn't really have an MSI file. It just has a single self-extracting executable. So to give you the rundown on this real quick, what I did was I just went ahead and ran it as if I were about to install it. It extracts all the files into a temporary folder on my user profile. So then I take all those files, I copy them into a network share, and I'll show you where their network share is. It is right here somewhere, Applications, Utilities, and WinZip. Okay, so this was the executable that I downloaded, and then I extracted all of the files that had been in a temporary folder into this WinZip binaries folder, and these were all the ones that were there. Okay, if I had finished the WinZip installation process, it would have deleted those files from the temporary location, and they would have no longer been available. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a group policy object that makes it available for these user accounts. By the way, let me do some other things here as well. Let me clean up a little bit, and I will no longer do these things. No longer enforce this. By the way, here's one thing I did forget to mention, so let me address that right now. Normally when you create a policy and you link it to an OU, by default it'll have this link enabled item. You can deselect that if you want to, which can be very useful, especially for things like troubleshooting, where you suspect that something's going wrong, but you're not sure if it's this policy or not. If I clear the link enabled, notice that it kind of grays this out, and then I can see whether the problem still exists. In my case, I don't really care about that policy for now, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. But I'm going to create and link a GPO in this domain now for my admins that will install WinZip. Okay? Alright, now, once I've done that, there's the policy. I need to edit this, and it is a user configuration policy. Remember, anytime you configure the user configuration, you need to link it to an OU where the user accounts actually are. Anytime you edit a computer configuration policy, you need to link it to an OU where the computer accounts are. So I'll go in here to Policies, Windows Settings, and then we're going to go here to, oops, long thing, Software Settings, excuse me, and then Software Installation, where we'll click a New Package. Okay. Now I need to go to a UNC path. Now, I don't want to use the drive letter that I showed you a moment ago where I browsed the source drive. Sometimes it gives me a red X here, by the way, thinking that it's disconnected. It's really not. Okay, once I double-click on it to access it, it shows up. What you should use in this, though, is you should use a UNC path. So that's whack DC1, source, and then I can just browse from there if I want to. But I want to use a UNC path because otherwise, all of the local computers will look for this software on their own S drive, which is where I had it mapped. So I'll go to Applications, Utilities, and WinZip. I think I had. Yeah, there we go. And there's my WinZip binaries where there's an MSI file. Remember I said earlier, it has to be to a MSI file in order for this to work. So I'll go ahead and publish this as well. And I could, again, if I assign it, then what's going to happen is it will forcibly install the next time the user logs on. If I publish it, then the user will see it in Add Remove Programs. And even non-administrators can do that then. So there it is. Now all I should have to do is to kind of let this thing happen. What I'm going to do is to log off as my existing user, and then I'm going to log back on, and I should see the ability to install WinZip. So here I've logged on, and even though I'm logged on as building one admin02, this account is not actually a member of the administrators group. It's just a kind of a account that I just created on the fly, and I have never added it to the local administrators. So what I'm going to do is to go to Control Panel, just as a generic user here, go to Programs, and as an unprivileged user, I'm going to install a program from the network. There it is. And then all I have to do is to click Install. And we see the install start to launch, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Then we would have our next finish, and we would continue on with the installation. I'm just going to go ahead and exit it for the time being, but you can see how software installation would then work. Now, something that I do suspect would be a big exam issue is that things such as this software deployment, Microsoft may expect you to have to know how to discriminate between different users in the same OU. Okay, so for example, if I go back up here, remember these are my actual admins user accounts. These are my actual user accounts. If they said that, you know, these users here should get the software, but these users here should not, well, number one, in real world, you probably ought to think about separate OUs for these people if they have different administrative requirements. But otherwise, if you want to use the Microsoft less efficient method, in many cases, then you would have to use what I showed you earlier, where you would go to the delegation. Let's go back over here, where you'd have to go to the delegation tab, and then customize the permissions here so that it is denied to people that you don't want it to apply to. Now, in a similar fashion here as well, you could go here to authenticated users. You could simply remove this, and then instead of using the deny permission on a set of users, okay, I'm going to remove that. Then you can just click on Add and add in the specific users or security group that you did want it to apply to, such as, building 1 admin 02, like that. I guess I better type in the correct name. I think I left a G out. There we go. Building 1 admin 02. So now it would only apply to that user. Just another way of filtering by security group or user account. All right, one more thing and then we'll conclude. Let's take a look now at something called template files. The usefulness of this is that we want to have consistent template files across all of our administrators who edit policies. I mean, you might have a global organization where somebody in France is editing policies, and then when they edit that policy, there might be a policy that appears in the French version of ADM templates that does not appear in the English version of ADM templates, and then you have inconsistencies in your policies that could get broken. Let's talk a little bit more about what these ADM files are, by the way. In the old days, that's like Windows 2000 and earlier, we used ADM files. Well, these are simple text files that dictate what actually appears in a group policy. For example, the fact that there is a policy that says select an active power plan, the fact that there is radio buttons here and drop-down lists here. All of those things actually are available to us because they appear in a text file. In the old days, it would have been an ADM file that it was created, programmatically. Now, the thing with those is they are language dependent. That's why I might have a French version that has something different than what the English version has, and we could get some inconsistencies. They're also very inefficient in terms of the storage. There's a handful of them that appear in ADMs, and they usually occupy between 3.5 and 4 megabytes worth of space in the sysvol, because every policy that's created also has every ADM file that's available stored along with it in the sysvol. And that's for every policy. So I know a university system that I do a lot of work with, and they have several departments that have sysvols that are gigabytes in size just because of group policy. They have thousands of policies that they use. So there's a little bit of a problem here with inconsistency and storage and all those sorts of things. So what Microsoft wanted to do is they wanted to change us and move us away from ADM files and into what we call ADMX files and ADML files. You see, ADMX files are language independent. All that happens there is these work with any language, and then for your specific language there will be an additional folder that will contain your language, and it kind of plugs into these ADMXs and it reveals settings to you in your own language. The storage here is going to be very efficient. Why? Because all the ADMX files are not stored with every policy the way ADM files were stored with every policy there. Here what we can use is something called the central store. So we'll have a one-size-fits-all storage location for our ADMX files. Anytime anybody on the planet tries to edit one of my policies, it reads the ADMX files from our central store. And then as a result, we have one consistent copy that gives us very good consistent results. Now here I've gone to one of the policies that we created a little earlier, the Add Sidebar item, and I've gone to this Settings tab. By the way, this is just an XML page that shows you all of the settings that are there, makes it very easy to read, and it prevents you from having to dig into the policy to explore thousands of different policies to see which one is enabled or disabled. So here it is. It tells me it's this Turn Off Windows Sidebar item, and look, here it says the policy definitions are retrieved from the local machine. You see, what's happening right now is this is going to behave a lot like ADM files, where every person that edits a policy is going to use the local copy of their ADMX files. These ADMX files, by the way, are available on both Server 2008 and Vista, and so I could edit this from a Vista computer and see the same thing right there. So what I want to do is I want to go to a location, a given location. Let me find it. It's called Policy Definitions right here. This is where all of my ADMX files are now located. Okay, so for example, if I double click on this and I open it up, I'll just use Notepad to open this thing up. There it is. Then what we'll see here is, yeah, we got a lot of different settings here that are available to us in this XML file, okay, for relating to screensavers or whatever it is. Well, rather than having every individual computer where this policy will be edited copy its own version of ADMX files, what I'll do is I'll copy this entire folder right here on a known good machine that has good policy definitions, and I'm going to go down to my policies location under the Windows sysvol domain and policies item, and I'm going to right click here, and I'll just choose paste. Okay, I have to have administrative permission to do so, so I'll continue on through this. Okay, and then once I've done that, I'm going to go back to Server Manager, and what I can do is to refresh this. And by clicking on the little refreshy button up there at the top, I'm going to go back to Show All now. Now we can see that the ADMX files are retrieved from the central store. Yeah, they're being read directly out of the sysvol now, right here. And this would take place if I edited it on a machine in Taipei, China. It would still be reading them from the central store, and that way I have a single central location of these ADMX files that gives me great consistency. Alright folks, what I've done here obviously is installed a webcam, and the reason why is because there's a group policy function that you can use that will disallow installation and use of certain types of devices, like USB devices, like this webcam, or flash drives, and the like. And you can allow certain brands to be installed, or you can cancel any kind of USB webcam or flash drive of any brand. So it can be general or very specific on this as you like. By the way, while I've got this webcam here, and the reason why I'm hand holding it is because it's got a little stand that's kind of broken, so I'm holding it on here. Just give you a quick rundown of the office. This is obviously my office, and there's some bookshelves and some files, and there's my couch. I use that to counsel highly distraught and psychotic IT administrators. Of course, right now it's got a bunch of camera equipment on it because I'm a photographer too. My wife's mad at me because she never has a place to sit in my office so that we can have our delightful little talks. And then here's my actual desktop. This is my production desktop where I check email and all that kind of stuff. And then this is the teaching monitor that I use that you're looking at right now. This is a drawing pad that I use. Sometimes you wonder, how do I draw all these whiteboards and stuff up here? Well, that's why, because I've got my little drawing pad that you can see down here. Of course, that's just about as legible as my actual handwriting. Okay, enough of that. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this webcam now so that it doesn't require quite so much disk space and perhaps bandwidth if you're watching this over a streaming video, and then we'll proceed. Alright, so how am I going to prevent these webcams from being installed? The first thing I need to know is what it actually appears as in Device Manager. So here I'm just going to go ahead and plug it back in. I'm not going to record it though, but I'm just going to plug it in so it appears in Device Manager here. And we can see that it's somewhere in here. It should appear there. It is Imaging Devices, and there it is. Now what I need to do is to go to the properties of this and go to Details. And then I need to look at hardware IDs, and you can see here the general is at the bottom and the specific is up at the top. So this is a general ID of this type of a device. If I wanted to restrict this kind of device in general, I could use this identifier, or the most specific one is this exact make and model of device. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to say, you know what, we don't want anyone to use this exact make and model, this NX3000 of the webcam. So what we could do then is we could create a policy for that. So I've already done that in advance, by the way, just to kind of save ourselves a little bit of time. There's my disable webcam policy, and as I choose on edit with this thing, you'll see that if I go under policies and then go down here to administrative templates, and where was it? System device installation. There it is. I just had a moment of blanking out there for a moment. Okay, so there's my device installation, and I want to go to my device installation restrictions and take a look at this. I can, as I set this up, I can prevent installation of any kind of a removable device, or in this case, I've decided to prevent installation of devices that match any of these device IDs, and I've enabled that and clicked on Show, and I just clicked on Add, and I pasted in my value there, which you can see I've already done. Okay, so then I clicked OK past all of this, and now I've got an enabled policy that will prevent installation of anything that matches that device ID. Now, why was I able to use my webcam even though I'd already created this policy? Well, it's not linked anywhere. So I'm going to link this to the domain. Okay, and then we'll click OK. Now what I would have to do here is, and this is just kind of a little caveat with this, this would not prevent this webcam from working. You might say, James, thanks a lot for the useless policy you just showed me. No, actually it would not, because I've already installed the device drivers. This policy that we see here only prevents new installation of the drivers. So if I really wanted this to work in my particular environment, what I'd have to do is to right-click on this and choose Uninstall for this particular device, and then I think it'll prompt me to restart the computer, or it might. I guess not. But anyway, now that I have uninstalled it and removed it from Device Manager, now I can just update the policy, and I'll do a GP update, and press Enter. Okay, now that that policy is enabled, I'm going to go ahead and try to plug back in my webcam to see if, Sweaty Freddy can look for his Russian brides on the internet during his lunch break. And it's trying to install the device driver software, and then all of a sudden, we're going to get a strange message here. Shame on you, Sweaty Freddy. Stop looking for Russian brides. Where did that come from? Actually, I added that in the same place where you configure the policy. There's also some text that you can put into this word balloon here that you can customize for your own liking. And that adds a little bit of fun to it. And humiliation, which is also great. But otherwise, this device is now forever relegated under other devices, and it can never be used. Now, of course, you can use other things that you've already learned about. For example, maybe on some OUs, you don't want them to have this disabled webcam. Well, of course, you can block inheritance, or you can do things such as, again, going to delegation and applying this to only certain computers now. Since this is a computer-side policy, on the delegation tab, we would be entering in computer objects here, computer counts, or security groups of which computers are members. And then we would exempt, perhaps, certain ones. Other things that you could do is to actually go into the policy itself, and if you look at it a little bit more specifically, you'll see that there are also various settings in this. If I get down into the right settings here, under device installation, and back to device installation restrictions, where you can allow administrators to override device installation restriction policies. So maybe I don't want Sweaty Freddy to look for Russian brides on the internet during his lunch break, but maybe I do. So I could exempt myself from that same policy here if I wanted to, and I would just enable that policy. I could also say prevent installation of any removable device, such as USB flash drives, or allow installation of devices that match any of these device IDs. Maybe my department has issued an exact make and model of USB flash drives, and I would explicitly enable only those devices, and I would click on Show, and I would add back in exactly whatever their hardware IDs were here. I would be very well aware of that, probably for exam purposes. In this nugget, we talked about group policy strategy. And one of the important things there is to understand good OU design, because if you set that up properly, you won't have to custom modify the flow of inheritance very much. So we start off by talking about OU design, and then we took a look at what group policy actually is, just kind of a quick review. Then we took a look at the scope of management so that you can see the predictable results of how policies apply, and then sometimes you need to modify that default behavior. One of the ways that you can modify that, we saw, was by using WMI filters. By the way, these modifications and these WMI filters and the like, you want to use those sparingly if at all possible. Also, we took a look at software installation and how to work with the new template method in Windows Server 2008. And this is something that's called the Central Store. Then we also took a look at devices and how to control whether or not various types of devices can be installed. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.